Hello and welcome to Ride Rescue. In this episode I'm going to get these front fenders all in primer. I've done all the body work now, everything's all smooth. I've got all the paint, the original red paint scuffed, all the rust areas taken care of. So I just need to get a good heavy coat of primer on these so that I can go over all of the sanding when it comes to the little pits from the rust, any sand marks that's in the paint, but especially the sand scratch and any little bubbles or anything that might be in the filler. So with a couple of heavy coats of primer, it's a primer surfacer. It goes on pretty heavy, pretty thick. Most cases, just with a little bit of guide coat, I can sand everything down and I don't need to go back over with any more filler or spot putty, but it'll be a good indicator once I get these all sanded down on how they're going to look. So, now that everything is smooth, I've taken the time to take the gloss off of all the red paint that is left. Make sure that I've got a good bond for the primer to stick to. I've set it up on some sawhorses where I can get from top to bottom easy as I prime it. I'll put a good 2 coats of primer surfacer on all of the surfaces. It's a primer surfacer that bonds to all the metal as well as the filler and paint. It's a 2-component primer surfacer with hardener. Dries fast, sands fairly smooth, fairly quickly, and once that's complete, I'll be able to put on the paint. Got my surface wash. We'll wipe the whole thing down. As I'm wiping this down, it's just reminding me, years ago, blue rags, I wiped a car down one time with a blue rag and I had horrible fisheye. Come to find out, the blue dye has a silicone. I don't know if it still happens with more of the recent rags, but these older rags, don't use it for wiping them down because you will have fisheye issues. I like to use a good white terry cloth towel when I'm wiping down. One more thing, gloves. Surface wash is harsh enough. Should wear gloves. Back to it. And we're almost ready to put a coat of primer on, so we'll tack rag it off. Make sure we get rid of all the lint and dust here. Just a minute here to mix up some paint, get my gun ready, and we'll start spraying. like we're gonna have to give it a minute, let it flash off just a little bit more. It's still a little too wet. Primer will typically dry much faster than this, especially when I thinned it a little bit. But with these temperatures, it's going to take a little bit of time to cure. So we'll give it a few more minutes. Okay, so what I just did, as you've noticed in the video, I've given the whole fender area on both sides a heavy wet coat, and then give it another second wet coat. And then there's a few areas where I can see some sand scratch. There's some areas where I can see some little pinholes and little bubbles. So I went back over those areas with a third coat and put it on as heavy as I could without it sagging. And then I used some dark gray or black sandable primer and just mist the whole thing as a guide coat so that when I go back and sand, I'll be able to see any low spots, any heavy pits, areas like that I can go back with just a little filler putty and glaze over those little areas and then finish sanding. Hopefully I won't have to give it any more primer. Let it cure for a few hours and start sanding. For those of you that are curious as to what I was painting with the gun, it's a central pneumatic gun I got at Harbor Freight. It's not the best spray gun. It works really good for the primers. It has a heavier tip. I'll have to look up. There's two tips that come with the gun, one for a finer spray and one for a heavier spray. I use the heavier spray with the primers. I have a regulator that I use. The gun does have a built-in regulator, but it doesn't have a gauge. So by putting on a regulator with a gauge, I can have more control over the pressure that I use. And then I put in an inline filter. This filter is for picking up moisture as well as any particles that's in the line from the air compressor. Like I say, for primers, I've been very pleased with this, and if I break it, I'm not too worried because I didn't spend a whole lot of money on it. Now the primer is dry on the fenders. I'm going to start with just using a Scotch-Brite on the inside lip of the fender. I just want to smooth it out and scuff it up so that I can put another coat of primer on. I'm going to be using a red oxide primer before I paint the red paint of the original finish. The red oxide primer is what was used on the car originally, and it'll help better match the original finish that I'm trying to match on the rest of the car. With the Scotch-Brite pad, I'm able to get down in these little fine details and little edges. It's kind of hard to do with sandpaper, but you can see this filler primer with a light coat of primer. It doesn't take a whole lot. This edge was a little wavy and rough from the rust, the surface rust that was on it. I sealed the rust, but it left a rough finish. With the primer, the Scotch-Brite, if I go back and forth over it with the Scotch-Brite, it will follow that contour and leave it rough. So with a 180 sandpaper, I'm just going over it, knocking off all the high points, and then the primer is filling the low points. And it's getting me a really nice metal finish. Looks more like a fresh stamping than an old rusty panel. So it's coming along. This area you can see the original stamping and folding of the metal when it was manufactured and welded and spot welded. If I was to put heavy primer on this area, especially a primer surfacer, I could sand this with sandpaper and knock out a lot of these details. With the Scotch-Brite pad, it gets down into all those details, and for a restoration I want to keep that look and not fill it in too much. It's pretty easy with the heavy filler primer to kill all those details and make a car like this over restored. I'm a little concerned with this crown having a little bit of a wave in it. This area of the fender had been worked before. This is where the fender that had the lead in it. And this crown, being on the top and with a high gloss, is going to be very noticeable if it's not perfect. So I don't want to have this crown have any wave to it or any imperfection when it comes to how wide it is or narrow it is. So I'm going to work this primer with a board that should tell me if there's any imperfections. So I'm going to use an 80 grit sandpaper and just kind of knock this down. I'll probably have to give it another coat of primer. But there's been areas like this on my show car that I worked 2-3 times with primer to get it perfect. But like I say, on the top of a fender where you're looking across it while you're driving down the street, the last thing you want to see is a little bit of a wave that will annoy you while you're trying to drive, and I'm wishing that you spent a little bit more time to make it perfect. So I'm going to do that. This is what I suspected. I have a high spot right here and a low spot right here. I've gone through the metal. So if I didn't, but if I hadn't have done this, I probably would have seen this high point on a high gloss finish. So there's a couple of ways I can remedy this. I can come back here with a filler, either a spot filler or a standard filler, and fill this low spot. Or I could get it with real heavy primer, and I can fill it with several coats of primer. I'll keep sanding it, see if there's any other areas that will need any filler, or if I only need to fill this one spot. Okay. I've got a high spot. I've got metal showing here. I've got metal showing here. It's very slight. There's only a little bit of the guide coat showing right here in this area. I can fill this high spot, so I'm not comfortable with doing this in a coat of paint or a coat of primer. So I'm going to have to put some filler in that low spot. The rest of this area feels good, so I'll scuff that up, and then I'll just come back in here with a little filler. I'll finish that off. See what this other side looks like. This side looks really good. The top of the crown is looking good. The guide coat is showing that I have everything smooth the way I want it on the top side. So like you say, you're going to have to put another coat on this area. Get that brush ready. So this area, as I sanded along this edge, there's a low spot here that I could probably fill with glazing putty, but this area feels like it's just a little too much for glazing putty. So I'm going to get out the plastic filler and just touch this area out. So I scuffed it up with 80 grit so I can get a good bite, good surface for the filler. There we go. I feel much better about that. My plans for this car is to match the fenders with the rest of the car. The car has the original paint, and most of the paint on the car is in pretty good shape. I mean, considering the age of the car. So with what I'm planning on doing, I'm planning on painting this with a single stage paint and then scuffing it and leaving it a matte finish that's going to match the rest of the car. So I don't need this to be a perfect finish, but this car is pretty special. So somebody down the road most likely will restore it. So I want to make sure that this fender is done as good as possible for the next guy. So it's just a little bit of pride and making sure that I know it's perfect and the next guy can see. All you'd have to do is scuff this finish and repaint it. You won't need to strip it all the way down to bare metal and completely start over again, especially with how much work has been done to this fender. I just want to make sure that it's done right. Just noticed a little bit of a bubble there. We'll finish that. But a little bit spot there as well. Use this as a spot filler. We're good. And this is the fender that just had the small patch panel in it. It's not the one I cut the bottom off. It did have some stretch in it that I had to shrink up. So this guide code will tell us whether I got everything smooth. One of the things I wanted to point out is this low spot is not a real dominant crease, not a hard crease, but it's just enough that if I used a sanding block like this, I could make that wave. Pretty easy, especially with the primer surfacer. It sands rather quickly. So by using a longer board, and I'm going to use a little more aggressive sandpaper, I'm going to use an 80 grit sandpaper in this valley just to make sure that I keep it straight. I don't want it to start waving on me. If this was a real hard line, I would mask it. I would put a masking line on there so that I'd have something to follow. Sand this lower area, and then put a piece of masking tape on the lower area and take off the top and sand the top. But this has got just enough of a smooth contour, and I checked the door to make sure it has that same contour, that it's not a really sharp line. I know that by doing it this way, it's going to match up to the door. Now that I've got through the guide coat, pretty much what I was hoping I had a little bit of a high spot here because I was using the long board when I first did the filler on this. By going to the shorter board, then I can work more on the center area because that long board would probably have a tendency to leave it a little bit high, which was good. So now, as I'm sanding it with the heavier grit, I can see it's right where I want it to be. So now I'll go back to a finer grit and I'll finish it up, and I'll take out that heavy, deep scratch that the 80 grit is leaving. And then I won't have to go back with another coat of primer. So now, this ridge or this valley is where I want it to be. I'm not concerned about taking it down any further. So I can go over it now with a 180 grit and finish this off and take all that sand scratch out and then finish off where the guide coat is. This is coming along really good. I'm very pleased. I used the longboard to just lightly scuff over this fender well. This fender well was the one that was bowed in. It was bowed in about 3/4 of an inch. By using this longer 180 or 80 grit, I should say, and just scuffing it lightly, I was able to see if there was going to be any high spots or low spots with the guide coat, and it was perfect. So I just went back over it just lightly with the 180 to take that deep sand scratch out and smooth it out. And luckily I didn't go through the primer anywhere. So I know I have a good, smooth, straight surface there. And the other areas that I was concerned with, I was worried about a low spot right here. That came out just fine. I just finished sanding around these edges, and this fender is ready for a final coat of sealer, and it's going to paint. Really excited. Thank you for watching this episode of Bride Rescue. I love hearing from you. Leave me a comment. Give me a like. Give me a thumbs up. Every little bit you can do that way. It helps me to keep growing my channel. If you haven't already, subscribe, and we'll see you again next time. Bye now.